With both Resident Evil 4 Remake and the Ada DLC separate ways having come and gone, it's time that we look towards the future and what's possibly next for the Resident Evil franchise. In today's video, I want to look at the next 3 possible games that I believe may be coming to the Resident Evil franchise. There's the game that I wish was coming, there's the game I think is coming, and then finally, there's the game where all of this is going to wrap up. So to start, let's get into the game that I wish was the next game coming in the Resident Evil franchise, which is a remake of Resident Evil Code Veronica. Resident Evil Code Veronica is a game that unfortunately I feel a lot of people in the franchise have not had the opportunity to play. It's not as easily accessible as some of the other games like Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, etc., where you can find them all on modern consoles, you can find them on Steam. Code Veronica has kind of fallen into obscurity over the last few years. The game stars both Chris and Claire Redfield and was originally going to be Resident Evil 3 before that ended up getting switched to Resident Evil Nemesis, and Code Veronica ended up becoming a more of a side title. With where the franchise is heading, I really wish this was the game that was going to be remade next, as it will give more of the backstory on Chris and Claire Redfield, who I think could be heavily focused on in an upcoming game in the Resident Evil franchise. A remake would do very well for this game for a couple different reasons. As I said, a lot of people have not had the opportunity to play Resident Evil Code Veronica, so it would finally make this game more accessible to a modern audience, especially those who have maybe started playing Resident Evil with the recent remakes of 2, 3, and 4. Even for myself, even though I have played through the entire game of Code Veronica and I think it's an incredible game, even I haven't been able to play it as frequently as some of the other titles. Excluding the typical things that we have come to expect with the Resident Evil remake, there are 2 very distinct things that I would change for the upcoming potential remake. The first is a simple one and is something that I know could be kind of frustrating for players of the original Code Veronica, is how the weapons are exchanged between Chris and Claire. For those who don't know, the storage box makes a return in Resident Evil Code Veronica, and at certain points you switch from playing as Chris and Claire and vice versa. However, there are certain weapons that you have to kind of know in advance that you're going to be switching to another character soon, because if you don't put your weapons in the storage box before this switch, that character can no longer access those weapons in this particular run. If you are not dividing your weapons equally among the characters, this can lead to some kind of frustrating and unfortunate instances. I remember I was watching a streamer play Code Veronica once a few years ago. They didn't know that a switch was coming and unfortunately had all of their weapons on one character, so when they got to the final boss of the game, I think they had maybe like 10 shots in their pistol and then a knife. That's it. Now, of course, knife only runs do exist, so it is possible to do it, but as it was the streamer's first time playing, they eventually just got so frustrated and gave up and just ended up looking up the ending on YouTube because they couldn't beat the boss with their knife on their first ever try of the game. So to handle this, there's a couple different ways that I feel Capcom could address this. They could make it so each character has their own distinct weapons, therefore completely removing this problem altogether. This would kind of ruin the immersion, I feel, but they could give maybe a warning that a character switch would be coming in soon, or just when the character switch happens, any weapons that were on the other character's inventory just automatically would get placed in the box. Again, I feel this would kind of ruin the immersion a bit, so not really my preferred way, but I think just making this part of the game a little bit more accessible would go a long way and build favor in the Resident Evil fanbase. And the next big thing that I would do is I would give Steve the Ashley treatment from Resident Evil 4 Remake. Steve is a very important side character in Code Veronica, and while he has a good backstory that in a remake could really be fleshed out to make him a fan favorite character, the way he's presented in Code Veronica is he's kind of annoying. Kind of like how Ashley was in the original Resident Evil 4. But as we saw with the Resident Evil 4 remake, while still staying true to her character, they updated her to make her infinitely less terrible, to the point where the first time I finished Resident Evil 4 remake, I actually said, wow, I actually liked Ashley in this game. I think if they were to reapproach Steve's character while still keeping his fundamental story the same, it would make him much more of a memorable and likable character in Code Veronica. And without getting into spoilers, the stuff that happens later in the game would have so much more weight and so much more impact on the player as Steve's story plays out throughout the story of Resident Evil Code Veronica. And now for the game that I think we are actually going to be getting next is a Resident Evil 5 remake. Now, for those who have never heard me talk about Resident Evil 5 before, I always say it the same way. I think Resident Evil 5 is a really fun game to kind of shoot bad guys with your friends, while not necessarily the greatest Resident Evil game. And I say that having played the game countless times since it originally released back in 2009. With how Resident Evil 4 Remake ended, I'm pretty confident that this is where Capcom is heading with the Resident Evil franchise, and it feels like they're going to be focusing in on Chris Redfield's story, so a refresh of Resident Evil 5 Remake or bringing it to the modern audiences who have never played the original Resident Evil 5 just seems like the obvious choice. Assuming we are getting the Resident Evil 5 remake, there are a few things that I would love to see changed in this game. And the first big one is the removal of co-op. Now, Sheva fans, hold up. Just stick with me for a moment. I'm not getting rid of Sheva. My whole thing with co-op is in horror games, I always feel if you have kind of like a safety net or someone who is always with you to kind of get you out of trouble, it kind of removes any sort of tension or horror that could be presented in the game if you were by yourself. And seeing how Resident Evil has been kind of leaning back into its horror roots over the last few years, I think removing the co-op aspect of this game would be a great first step in accomplishing that. As I said, we're not getting rid of Sheva. There are a few different ways they could handle this. They could go back to maybe like the early Resident Evil games, say Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 2, where Chris and Sheva have two separate campaigns, and maybe they could overlap and intermingle between each character's campaigns to the point where maybe they'd even have certain sections where you can have some of that co-op come back before they end up splitting off onto their own again. This would allow them to bring horror back to Resident Evil 5, and also it would allow both Chris and Sheva's story to be expanded upon without having to worry about maybe smothering or pushing another character off to the side. We could learn more about Sheva's background. We could learn more about Chris and his ever-going battle with Wesker and Umbrella, and maybe they could even add some story elements in which would lead to where he ends up in Resident Evil 7. Or if they did not want to make the two different campaigns, they could just make it one continuous campaign where you switch back and forth between Chris and Sheva, kind of like Code Veronica. Another thing that I would change that I never really liked about Resident Evil 5 is the level system, where I always found it kind of jarring and took me out of the immersion every time you had to go back to a level select screen. I remember the first time I booted up Resident Evil 5 and saw that, I was just kind of went, oh, this isn't what I want, because I was coming from the games like Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, and 4, where you could go off and explore, you could backtrack, things I always loved doing, coming back with maybe an item you found later to find secrets that you had to skip on your initial run of a certain room or area. I always love in the Resident Evil games going back and just getting to explore, say, the mansion, the cabin, the Raccoon Police Department, wherever. So they could still have all the same areas like the town, the mines that are in Resident Evil 5, but they can make it part of a bigger world, kind of how they handled it in Resident Evil 4 Remake, where you can still have the story chapters to break up segments, but you weren't necessarily locked away from past areas or restricted to one specific area for the rest of the game. We saw them create elements of backtracking in Resident Evil 4 Remake with like the small keys, for example, or areas we found early on where you had to come back once you had Ashley so you could access them. Just things like that would allow them to create more of an exploration type of story that we're used to from the Resident Evil games, while also allowing them to expand on the areas that were presented in the original Resident Evil 5. I think in doing this, they could still kind of hold the action approach that was in the original Resident Evil 5, but it would allow them to bring horror back to Resident Evil 5 and expand on fan favorite characters like Chris Redfield and Sheva. My stars badge fell off in that last take. The production budget on this channel sucks. And of course, we have our final destination, Resident Evil 9. I believe Resident Evil 9 is going to be the culmination of the Resident Evil story that we know it as of today, and is probably going to wrap up certain character storylines that started all the way back in 1996 with Resident Evil 1. Assuming we have the Resident Evil 5 remake coming, this kind of further backs up what I think that Chris Redfield is going to be the main protagonist in Resident Evil 9. We saw him get reintroduced in Resident Evil 7. He played an important role in Resident Evil Village, and since we now know Ethan Winter's story has been wrapped up with the Resident Evil Village game plus the DLC, it's time to bring back Chris Redfield to the forefront of the Resident Evil franchise. I also think this would be a good time to bring back some of the old characters from the games that we haven't seen in a while. However, I think Capcom has to be very careful with not trying to do too much in one game. Since we haven't seen her in a while, I think Resident Evil 9 would be a great time to reintroduce Jill Valentine back into the Resident Evil franchise. As of this point, we haven't seen Jill since Resident Evil 5, which again is another reason why Resident Evil 5 Remake is more than likely the next game that's coming in the franchise. By bringing Chris and Jill back for Resident Evil 9, it would allow them to wrap up their story, or at least kind of wrap up one story and maybe pass the leadership of Resident Evil franchise over to Jill Valentine. They could bring Leon into this game because, as we saw, Ada was supposed to be in Village, but she ended up getting cut. So they could bring Leon and Ada in, but I worry that might be kind of too much, kind of overkill with trying to bring all these characters in for some almost kind of like Smash Brothers Ultimate, throw every character we've ever seen ever all in one game. Sometimes less is more. But by focusing on Chris and Jill, it would allow Capcom to have one final hurrah, and we can see where Chris has come from over the last few years, and we could finally wrap up the story of Chris Redfield and his lifelong battle against bioterrorism. As much as I don't want to see Chris Redfield kind of wrap up his story, it almost feels like it's time for some big Resident Evil character to maybe finish their story. We have spent a lot of time with Chris over the years, and Capcom with these remakes and with Resident Evil 7 and Village have been kind of bringing Chris back into the story as, I don't want to say a background character, but he hasn't been the main focus. So I feel like 7 and Village's purpose of reintroducing Chris to new players was so they could finally give one last hurrah to the Redfield man himself. They could even bring Claire in. Again, if they were going to bring in Resident Evil Code Veronica remake, it would allow fans to experience Claire's story from both Resident Evil 2 and Code Veronica, which would add even more weight to her impact in Resident Evil 9. Resident Evil 9 is more than likely going to be, as I said, the culmination of the Resident Evil story. I think some character arcs and character stories are going to be wrapped up and finished here before either setting the stage for brand new characters, or maybe going forward just focusing on characters like Jill Valentine, Leon, and Ada. There are a lot of characters in the Resident Evil franchise that tend to sit on the sidelines for long periods of time because there are so many. So in Resident Evil 9, they could finally give some of these characters the send-off that they properly deserve. I'm sure some people would argue that maybe Wesker can come back for one last hurrah, but like, we took care of Wesker, spoilers, I guess, in Resident Evil 5. I feel like Wesker's story is done. It doesn't need to be dug back up because we still need to figure out who was sending the, I don't think they were zombies, but the zombie-like creatures that were found at the end of Resident Evil Village. Maybe that was Wesker after, who knows? Maybe Wesker is coming back. Maybe Wesker was never gone. Maybe he was just bathing in the volcano for all I know. But maybe there is one last encounter coming because we still need to figure out who sent these zombie-like creatures, and Chris Redfield, in my opinion, is the man for the job. So to wrap up, Resident Evil Code Veronica is the remake I wish we were getting next, but as much as I want it, I doubt it's the thing. We're more than likely getting Resident Evil 5 remake next, which there's a lot Capcom could do with it. I still think it's a good game, but now with the remake, I think they can make it into a good Resident Evil game before finally wrapping up Chris's story with Resident Evil 9. Now, with that being said, I would happily admit I was wrong about all this if Capcom surprises us with a Dino Crisis remake. But unless they have some kind of trick up their sleeve, it is probably Resident Evil 5 remake, then leading into the finale with Resident Evil 9. Let me know what you think down in the comments below, and thanks for watching.